So this year, we've gone over what books? James, Daniel, and what? Timothy. Timothy's, plural Timothy's, first and second. Totes. So, James wrapped up everything last month with 2 Timothy. And so this week we're going to take a little bit of a zoomed out view of things and take a look at the whole, spend some time looking at the life of Daniel and how he's sort of incorporated some of the bigger principles of James and Timothy. So in the book of James, at the beginning of the year, we learned a lot about wisdom. In Timothy, we learned a lot about maturity. Those are the two things that we've been going over this whole year, right? Wisdom and maturity, and how those things communicate beauty in God's design. For Daniel, we can see that his wisdom and maturity worked itself out in a beauty that had a really profound effect on the people around him, like the different leaders and their family and the nation of Babylon even. But, Daniel's a great example. From young to old, he has many good examples of how his character exemplified the beauty of God. In Daniel 2, I'm going to read verse 19 or so through 23. Daniel 2:19. That night the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven. He said, "Praise the name of God forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and acknowledges and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in darkness, though he's surrounded by light. I thank you and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we asked of you and revealed to us what the king demanded." So that's the prayer, right, where Daniel is giving thanks after God revealed to him one of King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams to save himself and other people. But what I want to highlight in there is just that foundational aspect of wisdom, that from God comes all wisdom and power. And Daniel clearly understands this in how he behaves and the things that he says, and even in his direct communication to God. Daniel is, if you think about it, he's in a position where he's surrounded by the most powerful nation in the world. He is surrounded by people who have the utmost power, and yet what he sees in that is that their power is a farce, is empty, is nothing without God. And he knows that even though he's just one man, because he knows God, he has access to all wisdom and power, and that dwarfs even the great nation of Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar. In James, we see a sort of a paralleling foundational statement of wisdom. James says in chapter 1, verse 5, that if you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking, but when you ask him, make sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that's blown around and tossed by the wind. Such people shouldn't expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they're unstable in everything that they do. Clearly, Daniel was not divided whatsoever, and that he was 100% his faith in God and where he was looking to that, and did not give credence to those superpowers that were so intimately surrounding him. And that's awesome. That's super epic, because, a lot of us, when we're faced with such power right in our face, it's hard to remember where the real power comes from in that. Though Daniel knew that the world's wisdom was a joke, we see that Daniel was giving value to those people, even though everything that they held as right and true was wrong and was a joke. And that's something else that we find beauty in, is holding that balance of understanding where truth comes from and that people suck at life and so on and so forth. But Daniel is giving value and credence to those people anyway. Like in that first dream, when Daniel was, right after Daniel was revealed the nature and meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the statue, I believe, and how the thing was cut from the mountain, not by human hands, and broke the statue apart, and so on and so forth. And he was able to interpret that. But Nebuchadnezzar was going to kill all the wise men because none of them could display genuine wisdom and power in that. Daniel could have wiped out his competition. They were, clearly like liars and fakes, and they were a threat to him, but he decided to be graceful in that because they were still God's creations. That wasn't his place. God has the wisdom and power to decide those things. And so he asked for them to be spared in that. Even like King Nebuchadnezzar himself, Daniel is, we see him asking King Nebuchadnezzar in light of that dream, right? Where he wanted him to be spared from being forced to be eating the grass with the cows and be reduced to a animalistic nature and be kicked out of his position of power. That was a different dream. That was the dream about the tree, if you remember that. But Daniel says, King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what's right. Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. Even in the face of this world power that has, in theory, all control over everything in the known world, he looks to him and he says, you're in a bad spot. You need to stop doing these bad things. Try these things. This is what God likes. And he's not afraid to do that because he understands where wisdom and power comes from, and he understands the value of King Nebuchadnezzar as a person and wants to hold on to both of those things in the tension, even when you're standing before a king who can have you killed in an instant and tell him that he's wrong, he needs to do something different. And I think that you can see in Daniel's character his relationship with that person and that genuine love, even though that person is clearly has their life out of order and their economy bad, and they don't even love God in the way that they should or need to. But Daniel sees that his place is to offer that quality of relationship, quality of wisdom and maturity in that. We see that ideal in the wisdom from the Apostle James in chapter 3 when he says, but the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It's also peace-loving, gentle at all times, willing to yield to others. It's full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. See, a lot of times when we talk about favoritism, we're talking about, I guess it's the same thing, but we're talking about respecting God and not respecting man. In this way, it's sort of interesting and backwards because you're not respecting the power of the man, that apparent power of the man, but you are respecting the value of the man and looking past his power into what's actually important. And that is really interesting about Daniel and how he's able to do that time and time again. Daniel employs God's wisdom to speak and live with real power before the nation of Babylon, before its leaders, before its servants. And that sort of brings us into the second area where we see more in Timothy, where we talk about maturity and how maturity is about forward thinking with your faith instead of thinking only about yourself and others in the now. So it's not about responding to the power in the now. It's about looking past that and transmitting that wisdom and power through the moment and speaking to the whole of everything to where you can actually make a wave of that and let God's power actually gain momentum through the things that you're doing. If you think about Daniel, you can ask the question, does he ever look to like solve problems in the moment? Does he ever look to just like grab control and solve things in the moment? And I think that the clear answer to that is no. Like at the very beginning of Daniel, you see what's his first conflict like within the first couple paragraphs of the book. You guys remember? When they're first brought out of Israel. Heidi? Yeah. Yeah, it's the food situation, right? The king's rations that he's giving his slave people, essentially. Daniel doesn't look to try to like coerce in the moment or so on and so forth. He is like, let's give it like, 10 days and see what happens. And he's willing to yield to others. He's willing to allow God to work in his timing. Or interpreting the statue dream, he doesn't expect there to be a solution right on the money. He's okay with being at peace with it and saying, give me a little bit more time with this. And then he goes home and uses his people and his support system and his God, and he collaborates with all of them. He takes that idea of wisdom about God has all of the knowledge and all of the power and so on and so forth that you need, and then transmits that into a larger view, like a more long-term looking situation than just trying to look for things solving in the moment, McDonald's society mentality. So he goes home and finds a solution for that. And even after he's nominated, after Nebuchadnezzar lifts him up into a position of power, the first thing he does in maturity is looks into the foresight of things and says, okay, I'm here. Now I'm going to have the guts to ask for something that is, kind of crazy. He raises up his friends that were with him in that moment before, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and puts them into positions of power over the whole country. It's like if you were to be elected president and then say, now what I want is to re-elect all of the governors of all the states. That has foresight, and that has a maturity to it about forward thinking, about setting up a position where he uses those people that are in God's design and God's worldview and understand that situation, and he puts them into good positions in that mature, forward thinking aspect. And we even see that in Timothy, where Paul is telling Timothy to make sure to raise up and select leaders that you know will be able to transmit this ideology, this godly mindset and worldview. In 2 Timothy, we see more aspects of forward thinking that Daniel is right in line with. If you remember, only a couple weeks ago, we were talking about not quibbling over words, not being focused on arguing and winning things in that moment, but having the maturity to look outside that moment and see what the bigger goal is, what the long-term situation is, and not be worried about what's happening in the moment. Give God a chance to work through it, and give yourself a chance to be used as a piece in that. If you don't have a godly solution in the moment, have the patience and the maturity to be able to push through that. Daniel, you can see, never threw his power around in the moment. He was very graceful with his power. He didn't even pick fights with his enemies, which I'm sure he knew he had plenty of, because, essentially what Daniel was made into was a politician, right? And I can sympathize with that. I would hate to be a politician. And certainly people did try to come and take him and throw him into a lion's den. But instead, when he finds conflict, Daniel asks for time. He doesn't seek to run and escape that conflict, but gives God a chance to work in a way that is in line with how God would do things, and not just trying to escape and avoid consequences. And I suppose a good distinction to make with that is that it's not just forward thinking. It's not just planning. It's not just doing what anybody would do. But there's a major faith element in this, knowing who God is, knowing the character of God, and relying on that as you give yourself time to figure out a situation, to see what God has planned, because as we all know, God plans things that we would never think about. And then those other things that we mentioned earlier that Daniel was really good at, like willing to yield to others, seeking peace, gentleness, sincerity in his relationships, and all of those things really transmitted the beauty of God we could see over and over and over again. And I appreciate the sentiment in 2 Timothy also that we went over a couple weeks ago, just about keeping yourself pure and honorable and ready to do good works, to be used by God for every good work at any time. And I think that Daniel had a good idea of that. When I read through the scripture about him, I think we get a really good sense that Daniel was a person that kept himself pure in all regards, from the very beginning to the very end. Kept himself honorable, kept himself ready to be used for good work. And he had a long life. And it sounds like God didn't necessarily use him actively throughout that whole thing. Like, for example, not Nebuchadnezzar, but King Belshazzar. He was a bad king, and he sort of pushed Daniel off to the side, it seems. But Daniel was ready for every good work, even when he was pushed off to the side. And when the time came, with the hand writing on the wall, right? What's the first thing that happened is what's called the Queen Mother, which I think was King Nebuchadnezzar's widow, is what it should be. Or at least somebody that's related to him, somebody that was from the last lineage. He still had a good relationship with her and a good reputation. And the second that there was an opportunity for him to come back in and his role to be fulfilled, he was ready for that good work. And he came, and she knew that he was ready for it, because she said, hey, I know a guy. I know a guy who can read this. I know a guy who can advise you. And he was ready for that in his forward-thinking maturity, that even though his time wasn't then, his time would probably come again. Together, we see that Daniel's wisdom and maturity formed a really beautiful example for the empty wisdom of Babylon. And that made Daniel super legit and relevant in that culture and to the different leaders. As far as the relational aspect of things, firstly and most importantly, I want to point out that God considered Daniel to be at the top echelon, the best of the best in terms of this. God called Daniel his special possession when the angel came closer, more toward the middle end of Daniel, when he's starting to get more like visions of end times prophecy and things like that. But Daniel was freaked out by it, and he was awestruck and reverent of that power. But the angel came and said, God considers you his special possession. Like, you don't need to worry. Things are good. And that, first and foremost, obviously is a testimony to the character of Daniel. But that same testimony carries on to people, because we can't help but to see that beauty when a person truly communicates it, when they are pure to the extent that God is seen through them, right? Do you remember that word purity, as we talked about a while back, how that means like a crystal, and how it's like clear and transmits light perfectly? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about pure. Daniel is kept pure, and God's light is able to shine through him, and people can't help but to see that. You can see that when that beauty is recognized by pagans in relationship with him, and it's not just like this ethereal recognition, but it's seen by their actions, and that's what I want to point out and draw attention to. He has like special relationships with them that, because of Daniel's character and because of his cooperation with God, it like pushed these people to operate outside of their own worldview and push them to operate more in line with God's worldview and how he expects and designs us to act. So, I mean, the first example of that would be like the chief of staff and the attendant with the king's rations at the beginning, like Heidi was talking about. We have these people that, they don't have any reason to do that. They're like, for fear of their life of getting beheaded by this king. But Daniel's like, I want to be pure in this. Give me some time. Let me show you what this looks like. And because of his already established good relationship with them that is alluded to in Daniel, we see these people that are willing to give grace and opportunity where they really shouldn't. They really shouldn't. They're endangering their lives for something as stupid as food. Like, they could have fed Daniel. He would have been fine, and he would have lived. And he wasn't even outright refusing. He didn't have leverage against them. He didn't have any of those things. But because of his relationship with them, they were willing to push the boundaries of their own small view of life and what is right. We have, like, the other thing that is really obvious is the whole lion's den situation. That's King Darius. Do you remember what his reaction was when he realized that Daniel is going to fall under the axe for the law that he put into effect? Yeah, he was like super broken up about it. He spent all day trying to figure out how to get Daniel out of it, and when he couldn't do that, he spent all night staying up worrying about it. It was something that profoundly affected that king. And I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what does that look like for us? I mean, for the king, he agreed with secular ideals, and he was not a godly king per se at all. But he did have a good relationship with Daniel, and that did propel him to have a certain attitude and a certain action and a certain, like, deep emotional response to that. And it also propelled him eventually to, like, throw out a lot of his, or at least set aside a lot of his secular notions about, all of the gods they had, and so on and so forth, and the rules of their law system, and so on and so forth. He threw out all those and loved Daniel, and then gave glory to his God in the end of that. And that is something that was clearly outside the normal for a person in that position. But Daniel's relationship with him propelled that action. We have to notice that the relational proof of God will, like, will win, I guess, against the, like, mental boxes of theology and culture that people have. Like, people are in their little boxes about what they've been taught in school. Like we were talking about in the car the other day, school teaches people nowadays to be in their little boxes and to not be, like, really flexible thinkers and so on and so forth. But those boxes are weak in comparison to the power of a pure and clear relationship, one based on, love and gentility and all of those, like, essentially fruit of the Spirit. And we just have to recognize that the truth of reality found in that pure relationship is what drives growth in a lot of situations, even with the most powerful of people. In fact, I would say that with the most powerful people, that's probably the only thing that drives their growth, because they're like the center of their world. They don't need like theology. They don't need their box of theology. They don't need their box of culture. Like, they make their own. But in relationship with another person, it's something that resonates, that forces them to see different things, to drive different things, and to grow in that way. So we should ask ourselves, like, would we draw out with our wisdom and maturity in relationship with other people? Would we draw out a profound response from our local, familiar pagans or less mature people? If you're like, and some of these things are in extreme situations, like where things come to a head, But if your health was at risk, if your job was at risk, if your relationship, for whatever reason, was on the line, like if they thought that they wronged you in a really crazy way or something, would that draw a profound response from the people that you know in those situations, your familiar pagans or like immature people that you know and are in a relationship with? Because of you, like, do those people operate outside of what makes sense for their worldview? What makes sense for their everyday behavior that you see? Do you see your example and relationship with them propelling them out of their boxes and encouraging them to do things that you can see? Do you see them being more loving in communication versus being impatient like they used to be? Do you see them being generous instead of being selfish like they should be? Do you see them expressing a significant and profound concern for a situation or for you versus the apathy that they should have? And certainly a lot of people do have those kinds of feelings and are like apathetic to that. But we have to, look at our relationships like that, see if we're being like Daniel, and with those people, whether they're powerful or not, propelling them outside of their comfort zone into the right direction, based purely on the tone that we're setting for the relationship and that resonance that we're creating with them, with the beauty of God that we're creating. How much respect do you have for the quote-unquote power of the authorities around us? Can you, when you look into the eyes of somebody that has this authority and power recognized, culturally or in academics or whatever it is, when you look into their eyes, do you feel it? Do you feel their power? Or do you see a role whose power is only extended by God? Do you see that, and are you like intimidated by that when you look at them? Or do you see them for what they are, as a person who has a very limited amount of control over you when it comes to the things that matter, but you are the one that actually has the wisdom and power that they need? Do you balance mercy and love with showing no favoritism like Daniel does? I think it's really easy to shut a person out because they suck at life and you don't really know what to do with them. Or it's easy to do the other end of that, where you are merciful and loving to them, but you don't have the acknowledgement of no favoritism, where you're not afraid to offer them help even when that's like hard to hear. Or are you like Daniel, where you both have mercy and love and compassion for this person, but also have the guts to like throw down because you know that you have access to God's wisdom and they haven't been willing to listen to it yet? Yeah, those are some questions to ponder for a cell group and for the week. So let's break.